Not everyone can afford to travel, but since I can, I always do my best to make the most out of it. I usually travel with someone, like my friends or one of my brothers. This time, none of them could come with me, having plans of their own. It was fine with me. I figured it would be a good time to experience and travel on my own. A lot of trips with my friends just involve us finding a new place to get drunk anyway, or going to some big place to see the popular landmarks. Me though, I like to take my time appreciating places, even these smaller, more unknown parts of the world, and I hadn't done that in a while. Since I wanted to save money and had been meaning to get more exercise in, I made this a cycling holiday. The town I went through wasn't my actual destination. It was just a place to stop for the night while I passed through. I don't even remember the name. The only reason I even stayed there was because I was behind schedule on my journey, the trip taking more out of me than I originally anticipated. I arrived in the afternoon, tired out of my mind and just wanting someplace to rest. On the road entering this town, there was a bed and breakfast. It was one of the first things I saw when I arrived, advertising itself with a sign right outside of the building. Gossamer was the name that it used. I got in, rushing through the process of booking myself in. I was tired, cold, and soaked with my own sweat. I hadn't prepared very well and the trip took more out of me than I thought. And from how things were starting to look outside, I would be soaking with something else soon if I went back out there. As soon as I paid for my room, I went where I was told. By the time I made it to my room, I collapsed on the bed and let my bag fall beside me. But I didn't sleep instantly. My stomach was loud enough to keep me awake. Still, I didn't feel like going back out and trying my luck at finding a pub or restaurant. A soaking wasn't worth a halfway decent burger, and I'd packed something anyway. Instead, I reached around in my bag and pulled out a packet of beef jerky. It wasn't much, but it was satisfying enough to keep me from going out. While I ate, focused enough to actually look at the room I was going to be spending the night in, there wasn't really anything special about it. Just a room for one with cream wallpaper, with a black radiator and an old TV opposite me with local channels you probably had to pay extra for. The door back out was on my right, and to my left was the bathroom along with a small desk with some wall sockets, 2 mugs, some tea bags and milk in small plastic containers, and a kettle. The bed itself was slightly uncomfortable, and the covers could have been thicker, but it didn't matter much to me. What was a little more uncomfortable was the smell. The best way I could think to describe it was artificial, like some sort of aerosol. I would have opened a window, but at that point, I honestly didn't want to get up for anything. After I finished the packet of jerky, the tiredness finally managed to dominate. I was barely able to get my cycling clothing off before I went to sleep. When I woke up, not only was I rested, but the discomfort was gone. I was still drowsy, but I tried to get up anyway. Once I did, I realized how difficult it really felt to move. But when I did, I realized that I wasn't just stiff, I was sore, and I had a few red bumps on my legs. When I looked down to the floor, I could see something red and shiny poking out from underneath the bed, so I reached down to see what it was. A can of bug spray, left by whoever was in the room before me, no doubt, that the staff forgot to clean up. Looking back at my legs, I realized that the place must have had an insect problem. Between the spray and the bite, it was easy to tell that they had bed bugs or something. I felt disgusted that I had to stay in a place like this, but I guess it made sense. B&Bs in the middle of nowhere didn't have to worry much about quality control. There was something else though, something that I felt like I had forgot. I put it in the back of my mind, had a shower, and I went for breakfast. Nothing spectacular. But I only got halfway through. The thought of those insects crawling over me and sinking their teeth into my body made me lose my appetite. I decided to look around town before I took off. I thought back to whatever it was that got away from me that morning, while I checked to see if there was anything interesting or historical. I remembered an attic, one I didn't recognize. It was pretty crowded, full of boxes with junk inside of them. I went to the window staring down. The ground, street, everything was covered in a sheet of snow. There were people down there too, on the street, in the road and on the front porch. They were all pale looking, and it was difficult to tell from where I was, but it looked like they each had the same face. An anxious feeling had swept over me, and I looked back to the boxes. Not knowing why, I just knew I didn't want to stay in the attic. Luckily, there was a stairway. The exit was covered in a thin veil, but it was open. I walked towards it, but didn't remember anything else before I woke up. My satisfaction at remembering my dream was diminished when I realized I was exhausted. Even though I thought I got a full rest, my legs ached and begged me for a break. With no real choice, I found the nearest bench and I sat down. When I felt ready to get back up again, I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. That shot me to my feet, which my legs didn't like. I began to think that maybe I had pushed myself too hard the day before, and had become clear that my body still wasn't ready for another day of cycling. That night, I ate an actual meal at an actual pub, before heading back to Gossamer's and staying another night. My dream was much clearer this time. I was in a hallway. My body moved with no real weight to it, and it felt like I was swimming. The walls were a mixture of gray and white, while it became difficult to take another step when my foot landed on the white portions. At the end of the hallway were several doors. The first one I tried, the middle one, opened with ease. Like the hallway, it was a large room. There was a desk, a chair, a coffee table, and a skylight looking up at an incredibly dull sky. The chairs and curtains looked like they hadn't been moved for years. I took a step towards the desk, feeling my legs catch and pull apart something. But in that moment, all that felt important was moving towards the desk. When you dream, sometimes you go somewhere or do something for no real reason, other than a weird sense that you have to. All of a sudden, my strange obligation turned into unease. The unease was emotional, but also physical despite it being a dream. Like a sudden stomach pain. When I realized I could feel, I noticed them crawling on me. Their bodies were an exotic blue, while I could see the tips of their legs and fangs were black. They had patterns on their backs that looked like some sort of spiral or net. I thought they were spiders, but they didn't look like any house spider that I had ever seen. While my movements were slow, they were just as fast as any spider in the waking world. They bit my arm the more I shook. I remember the pain rushing up my limbs. I felt like I wanted to scream, and that was when I woke up. It was difficult to move my arms and legs, and they felt even stiffer than before, to the point where even the covers felt heavy. And even when I managed to climb out of bed, I got rewarded with nothing but pain. I twitched for a moment, and I thought they were still on me, and then I noticed that there was a noise going through my room, and I looked to the nightstand. In the shock of it all, I forgot that I had set an alarm extra early. I looked outside to see the dawn of the next day. I looked down at my body and saw the bites on both my arms and legs. The ones on my legs were a different color now. They looked like the same color as the sky, but slightly darker, as if the skin had bruised. But when I touched it, it didn't feel bruised, just cold. Even awake, I stayed in bed for a few more hours. Metaphorically, physically, I still felt pretty stiff, It was difficult to explain, and it still is. The best I can offer is that the place just makes you lethargic, but I couldn't tell you how. My arms and legs had red blotches all over them, so I decided the first thing I wanted to do was get some rash cream. After that, a taxi. Screw saving money. I didn't want to spend another night with bedbugs. After a bit of walking around, I found the local chemist a few blocks away. It took me longer than I would like to admit. Everything in this town was utterly boring. There were no landmarks. What businesses were in the town had such mundane names that they didn't stick. The only barely memorable thing about it was gossamers. The woman at the counter looked bored, but when I opened the door she greeted me with a smile. I asked for some creams for the bites, and she gave me this look, asking if they were from a spider. When I answered yes, she directed me to a shelf by the window. She asked if I was staying at the bed and breakfast place, and I said yes, but from how she looked it seemed like she already knew the answer. In a town this small, everyone knows everyone, so I figured it probably wasn't difficult to spot a tourist, especially since this was the type of place that got so few of them. In frustration, she commented that they needed to sort themselves out. It was obvious that the place was infested with something or another, but they got so many few tourists that no one really paid attention to it, and it was the only real place to stay if you were stopping by. She continued to talk while I nodded along, content to let her do whatever gossip she needed to get out of her system while I paid for my skin cream. I didn't blame her for going on, with how dull this place was. Afterwards, I called a taxi service to ask them to pick me up. They said that they would be able to take me to the next town over, but they could only do it tomorrow morning. After buying some more bug spray, I went back to Gossamer's with a sigh. Shrill, if I couldn't get out of here by today, I was at least going to get a different room. I went to the receptionist to ask if I could move to a different room. He looked at me strangely before saying that he would check. After a moment, he confirmed that they did have a room available for me. Immediately after entering, I sprayed the whole room down. I'm pretty sure I used half the can, but it didn't matter. That night, I had another dream. This time, however, I wasn't in a house. Wherever I looked, I saw a lawn faded in a dull white, kind of like snow. Moving through was difficult, but not impossible. Ahead of me, there were people and animals covered in that same snow, so covered that they were frozen in place. It wasn't just them, but animals too, all frozen in the same places. When I squinted, I could see animals frozen, and some of the people had strange shapes. Another thing I noticed was that the snow around them was a lot less dull than where I stood. I walked towards them, wanting to look closer. I remember feeling heavier the closer that I got, my body starting to rock more. I started to see some of them making strange shapes with their bodies. When I got closer, the snow was lighter, but it also got more difficult for me to move. Closer than any of the people, there was a bench. With how heavy I had felt, and how heavy I had been over these last few days, it looked so attractive, even if it were a simple park bench. In fact, there was something about this bench that made it even more attractive than the bed I was sleeping on in the real world. I just wanted to get rid of that heaviness that hadn't gone away, and was now following me into my dreams. When the bench was just ahead, I took another step, but I fell and tripped over something, falling straight onto the bench. When moved to sit upright, I sat down on that bench. There was an odd sense of relief. I felt like it would be alright, and that the heaviness would fade away. For a moment it was fine, but ironically, I found it difficult to sit still a few seconds later. When my legs fidgeted, I figured it was already happening. When I looked down, I could see spiders crawling up from the snow, except I realized it wasn't snow. It was a thick webbing. The fidgeting turned to itching, which then turned to a strong irritation. I shook my legs and swatted them away with my hands, but they didn't stop coming, climbing up the bench to get me. I ran, but the heavy feeling came back to me. I moved past the frozen bodies, engulfed in web and hung up like puppets. Some were human. Some had shapes and structures that didn't look like anything that belonged on the planet. If you've ever tried to run in a dream and found yourself stuck in slow motion, it was similar to that. But the spiders didn't follow those same rules. They kept coming out of the webbing all around me and biting down, like they had been waiting until I was completely surrounded. The more that I kicked and panicked, the more of them crawled to the surface. As far as I could see, no matter where I looked, they were there. Hundreds and thousands of them. I heard the alarm when I woke up. I had set it to be as loud as possible, wanting to make sure that I woke up. It was hurting my ear a little, so I tried to switch it off, but I realized I couldn't move. My body was completely stiff, and the only sound in the room was my own breathing. I sighed and was about to lean my head back into the pillow when I thought I saw something, a small lump underneath the covers. Now that I realized, I could see a lot of them. And then they started to move. I could feel them crawling all over me, and my body felt more sore than ever, and the pain was getting worse. Everything hurt and it didn't stop. The pain first rushed up my legs and then my fingers. I managed a few weak kicks while that pain made its way in my body towards my neck. With everything I had, I rolled off the bed and fell on the floor. The pain stopped in my body, and I realized I was wheezing, but I felt like I could move again, if only slightly. When I looked over to the open covers, whatever was there had vanished. I bit the bullet and I called a taxi, cutting my cycling holiday short. I refused to go back to that B&B, but the more I waited, the more pain I felt. I looked at the bed a few times while I was waiting, part of me convincing myself just to lie back down and relax while the taxi got here, knowing I would feel better if I would just lie down. But no matter how cold or uncomfortable I was, I managed to wait out the urges. I was ashamed just to come back like that, but my parents never held it against me. I went to the doctors to inspect the bites on my body. They had been identified as spider bites, but they were unable to identify what kind. When they all turned that lightly bruised color, I began to shiver, needing constant heat. Eventually though, I did get better, but I haven't slept the same since. I get wary of places I find too comfortable, and I set more alarms. Later, I found out Gossamer shut down. The town that it was based in has no mention of it, and they treat it like it never existed. I don't sleep as much now, and if I've started scratching a lot more. Recently, I had another dream following a good night's sleep. Two things I don't get often anymore. The dream itself, I barely remember. But after I woke up, I felt something move underneath the covers and threw them off. My imagination, but out of paranoia, I checked my arms. There were small cuts along them, with a strange liquid oozing out, mixing with the blood. They felt sore and cold.